Hey guys, welcome back. In the 8th lesson of the official Bolt series, we're going to set up the health and damage mechanics for our platformer. Now currently, if we fall on the spikes, we just die, and that's great. That's what we want to do. The spikes will instantly kill us. But we're going to have monsters and enemies in our game that if we run into, we want them to damage us and not just kill us. And we're going to have a set amount of life, represented by the hearts, in the heads-up display. So if we have 3 life, we're going to show 3 hearts. If we have 2 life, we're going to show 2 hearts, and so on. So what we have to do is compare our player's life variable, or health variable that we'll create here in a second, to the number of hearts that we have displaying in the UI. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to loop over each heart and then decide if we should show a full heart or an empty heart based on how much life we have. So we're going to set that up. So first thing first, I want to go to my player object, and I want to make sure on the object variables editor here that I have a health variable, some way to represent health for our player. So health, just like that, and this will be an int value, an integer value, and I want to give me a value of 3. We're going to have 3 life starting out. We take damage, we take 1 damage, it'll go down, and so on. Then I want to apply this to my prefab so all the instances and all my scenes get the update. So we're going to write this code that handles displaying the amount of health that we have on the UI itself. So if we go back into the heads-up display scene here, and I go to my heads-up display object, and then we have row here, which is responsible for displaying all of our icons in our UI. Now all we care about are heart 1, heart 2, and heart 3. We're going to change those to be empty if we lose health. But on the row, what I want to do is we're going to work from there. So I'm going to add a flow machine to row. And now on this one, since we don't need to reuse this anywhere, it's just being used in the UI, we're again going to do an embed. And there we go. Now for this, we don't want the start event. We're going to do something every frame. Now every single frame, we're going to be checking our player's health, and we're going to compare it to the number of hearts that we're showing. And if we have to adjust it, we will. Now we're doing this every frame. Ideally, you could do this whenever a damage event is fired off. You could update the UI that way. But in our case, we're keeping it very simple. So we're going to just update it every single frame if we have to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep a list of all of these hearts in my graph here. And we're going to iterate through them. And we're going to compare the index of the heart that we're on currently, we'll say, to our player's health. If we have more health than the index, then it's a solid. We're good. We have enough health to display that number of hearts. If we get to a point where we have not more health than the index of the heart, then we'll make it an empty heart. And that'll make sense as we go here. So I'm going to create a unit that is a for each unit. Now this allows us to loop over a collection of items based on the number of items there are in the collection. And now for the exit, that is where the flow will go whenever the loop has completed. Body is where it goes for every single loop that it does. So every single iteration, flow will come from body, and we can control it that way. Index is the integer value of the current index of the loop. So if we loop through 3 times, it'll start out at 0, 1, and then 2, with a base index of 0, though it's very important. And then item is the item that we are looped on top of each iteration. So for this, I want a collection of my hearts. So I'm going to create another unit here, and I want to say list of game object. And I want a list of game object literal, and this allows me to define a collection, if I hit the plus sign here, of game objects. I want 3, so I'm going to do that right there. And what I'm going to do is hit shift space, come back out here, and I'm just going to drag my heart 1 into the top, heart 2 into the middle, and then heart 3 into the bottom, in that order. That way we can loop through them in order as they are displayed in the UI. So now I have a collection of my UI elements. So these are all references directly to those objects. It's exactly what I need to actually affect the UI. And all I have to do is take the output of the collection here and put it to the input of our for each loop. So now we will loop through 3 times, 0, 1, 2. And what we want to do every single loop is we want to set the sprite of that heart. So I had a unit out here that's going to say set sprite. Now this is a UI sprite, so it's going to be an image component. So image set sprite. And so every single loop, body is where the flow goes. So I'm going to take that and pass it directly into the set sprite. So in every single loop, we will set the sprite. Now what do we set the sprite to though? Well, we have to do a bit of math to find out where our health is compared to the number of hearts that we have. But the sprite that we want to set, we have to pass in which heart we're on to our set sprite, because currently it says self, and there is no image component on the row object, which is what this graph is defined on. So I want to pass in the item straight into self. So item is the object that we're currently looped on top of, so heart 1, heart 2, heart 3. So for each one, we'll say, okay, this is heart 1, this is heart 2, this is heart 3, and for each one, we'll set a different sprite based on the amount of health that our player has. And now I'll pass the update event directly into the for each. So it happens every single frame. So now what I want to do is compare the current heart we're looped on top of to the amount of health that we have. So let's think about this. If I have 3 health, 0, 1, 2 are my hearts, right? So I'll compare the first one. Is my health more than the index? 3 is more than 0, so yes. And then 3 is more than 1, so yes. And then 3 is more than 2, so yes. So we have a full array of full hearts. Great. If we have 2 health, 2 is more than 0, so yeah, full heart. 2 is more than 1, so full heart, so we have 2 hearts. 2 is not more than 2 though, so we only have 2 hearts, because if we don't have greater health than the index, we want to show an empty heart. So to do this, we have to reference the player's health, and we know we have an application variable set up for this, so I'll say get player. That's a reference to the player object, and then I want to get the object variable from the player object, so pass that in just like that, called health. And I want to compare the health to the index we're currently on, so I will add a unit that will give me a greater than. So is my player health greater than the current loop index? Now, if it is, we want to select a full sprite. If it is not, we want to select the empty sprite. So I'll add a unit here for the sprite literal, done this before, and I want to add the full heart. So come down here, find HUD heart full. So if we do in fact have more health than the current loop, show the full heart for that sprite. Paste that, show the empty heart. And then based on that decision, we have to pass that in to set the sprite, just like that. And that error there is telling me that I had accidentally deleted the application variable for the player. So I got that fixed like we did earlier there. So we have no error now. So let's test this out and see what happens. So our hearts are all full at the start. That's a good sign. If we go to the object here, we can change the health variable to 2. Cool, that works. And then to 1. And then none. Looks good. Then back to 3. So our health UI is working great. So now if we take damage by an enemy in the future, we will actually be able to display that in the UI. The next thing I want to do is, let's say we take damage from the enemy. Now, in a game like Mario or pretty much any platformer, when you take damage, you have a second or two of invulnerability where you can no longer take damage. And then for every other time, you are vulnerable to damage. So we want to set that up so you can be vulnerable to damage until you take damage, and then you have a second or two of invulnerability. So you can't just run into somebody and then take 3 hits within the span of 2 or 3 frames. We want to make sure that you are invulnerable for a bit so you can get away from the danger, and then you can get back into fighting whatever it was. So to do this, we'll use a state machine that allows us to transition from vulnerable to invulnerable based on a couple of conditions, based on a couple of transitions. And we're going to set this up on the player. So I'm going to add a component, and I'm going to add a state machine to my player. And we're going to create a new macro here, and I'm going to call it player health. And save that. Now you'll notice the icon for the state graph is different than the icons for our flow graphs. Makes it easy to see what's what. So if I select that, I have a start state. And we want this to be our vulnerable state, so the state where we can in fact take damage. So I'll double click on this, or click edit graph, so double click. Now in here we have an on enter state, an update, and then an on exit state. So this is what happens whenever we first enter the state. This is what happens every frame while we're in the state. And this is what happens right before we transition out of the state. So in here with no unit selected, I want to come up here and give it a name. I'm going to call it vulnerable. And the summary is can be hurt. Now if I go back, you can see the breadcrumb trail here. If I click player health, it'll take me back out to my state called vulnerable and the summary of can be hurt. Cool. Now within vulnerable, we're going to set up the damage mechanic. And for this, we don't need any of these events. We're going to actually set up our own event. It's going to be another custom event, much like we did for the spikes. And now on this, I'm going to call it damage. It's the name of the event, and it's going to take 1 argument. The argument being the amount of damage the player should take. We're going to take that amount of damage and subtract it from the player's health. And then later on check to see, is the player's health less than 0? If it is, player should die. Now keep in mind, this can only happen as long as the player is in the state of vulnerable. So get object variable, and I will call it health. Now this is on the player object, so we should be able to get the health variable just directly like that on self. And we're going to do a subtraction here. So subtract, we're going to subtract from the health the amount of damage that we dealt. Simple as that. So whenever this event is fired off, we're going to pass it the amount of damage to deal to the player. We're going to take the player's health and subtract that amount of damage from it. But we want to make sure that we don't go below 0, right? The maximum damage that we can take is 3. If we go below 0, it's going to go into the negatives, and that doesn't make any sense. So if we take the result and we say the maximum of two values, so of a minus b, so if that goes down to 0, or an int literal of 0, so whichever one of these is the biggest number. So if we take 1 damage and we have 3, this will be 2. So 2 will be the result. If we take 4 damage and we have, -1, 0 will be the biggest number, so it'll select 0. It'll never go below 0. That's the idea. And then we take that value and assign it back to our health, right? Because all we're doing right now is taking the value, taking a copy of it, doing math on it, but we're not actually assigning the value back to health. So I want to say set object variable, pass in the value, and it's called health, right? And whenever this event fires off, we're going to pass the flow straight into the set variable unit. Now keep in mind, this is what happens while we are in the vulnerable state. Let's add a group to this. I'll call it take damage. And now what I want to do is take the value that we just assigned to the variable, come from that and see if it is 0. If it is 0, then we should die. So take that value, say, is it equal to, and the value I want to compare it to is 0. So an int literal 0. If it is in fact 0, then we should die. So how do we do that? Well, we can branch off and say, if it's true, fire off our death event that we defined for the spikes. If it's false, I want to just play a hurt animation to show you that you got hurt, you took a damage, that kind of thing. So if it is true, let's branch off of that, pass the flow directly into the branch. So if true, custom event, trigger, and I want to trigger the death event. Now the listener for the death event is on player, so self is fine, and it requires no argument. As we know, it simply just kills the player. Now if it did not kill us, if we did not reach 0 health, all I want to do is play an animation that's already set up in the animation controller that will show you that you got hurt. So set trigger in the animator by name, and the name of this is hurt. Name of the trigger in our animator is hurt. It's going to transition to the hurt animation to show us that we did in fact get hurt. Now, after we do that, what I want to do is I want to fire off an event that will say that we got hurt. That way we know to transition to our invulnerable state. So we just took damage. And now for the next second, I don't want to be able to take damage again. I want to be able to get away from what just hurt us, right? So think about in Mario, you run into a Koopa, your guy's going to go flashy for a bit so you can't actually take damage for the next second or so you don't actually die in one hit and take 3 different damages. So for that, I'm going to pass this out and say custom event, and we're going to trigger an event that we don't have set up yet, but that's fine. I'm going to call it hurt. And this requires no argument. It's simply going to fire off an event that will transition to the invulnerable stage for a second or so. So let's organize this. Dead, hurt, and then we'll say check if dead. That's all we have. Take damage, check if we died. If we did die, fire the event. If we didn't die, show the animation, but then fire off the event that says we took damage. Now back to our state graph here. We have vulnerable. Doesn't look any different, but it does show that we have a custom event now. And I want to add another flow state here that will be the invulnerable state. So we know that while we're in the vulnerable state, we can take damage and in fact die. But once we take damage, we fire off that event that I want to transition me to the invulnerable state. So let's change this name real quick to invulnerable and cannot take damage. There we go. So now let's create two transitions, one coming from our vulnerable state to our invulnerable state, and then one coming from the invulnerable state back to vulnerable. So that's the way we get from state to state, is a transition. So for this, I can right click and say make transition, and then drag it down and click this unit, and we'll create a transition just like that. Or I can hold down the control key and drag and let go. There we go. So one transition to the invulnerable state, and then one back from invulnerable to vulnerable. And with dim on, I can see that these are in fact disabled because they are not being traversed. There's nothing saying when to come out of this state into this state or when to go back. So we want to fix that. And we know that we want to go into invulnerable the second we take damage. So what I'm going to do is click on the transition to vulnerable, and I'm going to double click it. And now in here we have a trigger transition state. And what I want to do is trigger the transition whenever that event that we set up for hurt is fired off. So I want to say custom event, and it was called hurt. And once that event is fired off, that means we took damage, so we're going to transition to our invulnerable state. And now we have a transition that you can see is the event. So we transition back after, we'll say, a second has passed. So if I double click on this transition here, what I can do is I can say on timer elapsed. Now this allows us to define a time in seconds before the event is fired off. So I will say 1 second. After 1 second has elapsed, we'll transition back. So now we get hurt, we go to the invulnerable state. After 1 second, we go back to the vulnerable state. And now for these transitions, we can also give them a title and a summary. And now to implement this, all we have to do is make sure that we set the player to be on the player invincible layer. And if you recall, in the initial project setup, we set up the layer collision matrix where our enemy's layer would not collide with our player invincible layer. And the reason we did that is so that whenever we go into the invulnerable state, all we have to do is put the player on that layer. And after we transition out, we'll set it back to the regular player layer. So in our invulnerable state, we don't need the update for this. So whenever we enter the state, I want to set the layer to be player invincible. So I'll say set layer, game object set layer, and then the layer you want to set it to. So I'm going to drag this out, and I'm going to say name to layer. That allows me to give it a string value, and it will convert that to the layer I'm looking for. So I want to set this one to player invincible, the exact name of the layer. So now whenever we enter the state, we'll go to the player invincible layer so we cannot collide with the enemies. And whenever we leave the state, we have to go back to our regular layer, right? So set layer. And then again, name to layer, and back to our original layer of player, the player layer. And that's all we need for this system. So we can't really test this just yet until we implement the enemies, but we'll be doing that in the next lesson. So my name is Austin, and I will see you there.